the PowerPoint I'll be using in the chat. I'm going to try to screen share, but I know we had some technical difficulties with that in Discord before. We'll see.
Your mic is slightly hot. Just be aware of that.
Okay, thank you.
And then just for anyone on this channel while she's getting set up, this is being recorded to be used at a future date, so just please be aware of that. We're going to put it on our YouTube for further advertising for Pagan Pride.
Hello. Is there anybody there? Hi. Hello. Oh, I'm in the wrong room. Sorry. said the most important part, which is no. Here then. That's all, yeah, it's not this.
Oh, gracious, thank you. I've just been told that my mic is off, and has it been off the whole time? Oh my goodness. Well, thank you for pointing that out. I've been going for a good 5 minutes there, probably, with the mic off. So thank you so much, Matt. The audio difficulties are with us today. Oh dear, now I can't hear you. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Matt. That would explain why no one was answering when I was asking for confirmation. I thought everyone else's mics were off. Okay. Gracious. Well, I'm sorry about that, folks. I will give a brief recap of the last few slides. Does anyone have any questions they know they want to ask so far that I perhaps was unable to hear before? Okay. Alrighty. Let me just check the text chat as well to make sure I'm not missing anything else.
Sorry, everyone, for the technical difficulties. We're working to get it fixed as soon as possible. We're very sorry about this.
Thank you, Twyla. I'm 90% sure my audio issue was on me, but okay, yes, I see the text attempting to notify me. That's off. Okay. Well, let's do this properly. If we have any stragglers, they will now have gotten to tune in. And let me triple check that my mic is still on. It says it's on. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Great. All right. Thank you. All right. So, Loki worship and you, and also just as a subtitle, world religions, because there's actually a lot of interesting comparative religion things we can say about how Loki's viewed. Questions we're going to answer in this presentation is why should we talk about Loki worship? That it's not something that I hear a lot about personally in public pagan circles, but it can tell us some really interesting things about comparative religions in general. Who worships Loki and why? What does Loki worship mean to them? I notice there are some misconceptions out there about that I've run into. And then the big question of Loki is Loki a necessary trickster figure like those found in a lot of indigenous religions, or is he a villain like what are found in a lot of imperial religions? And what can different interpretations of Loki tell us about the people doing the interpreting? Because I have found that there's some interesting correlations between people's attitudes toward Loki and their attitudes toward other things. Anyone have any questions, concerns, funny stories they'd like to share? Alrighty. So for the question of why to discuss Loki worship, why am I teaching this class? Well, Loki is my primary patron, which is one reason, but it's also an issue of increasing relevance, I think. There's a rapidly growing group of people who identify as Lokians, at least 1,300 members of one Facebook group. And there's really been an explosion of books and articles published in the last 10 or 15 years by Lokians about Loki devotionals. I've got a bunch of those linked in the references at the end of this PowerPoint, by the way. And I find this fascinating because, as I mentioned, Loki does kind of straddle this line between the devil figure in imperial religions and the trickster figure in indigenous religions. And I am wondering if it's possible that his increasing popularity is signaling kind of a mindset shift in our society where maybe we are moving away from an imperial kind of everything is good or bad, right or wrong, to more of a holistic, like growth and balance sort of view. And looking at Loki worship really does address some of those attitudes and differences that we find between different types of religion. Anyone have any questions so far? All right, so as we've covered, there are 1,300 people in online groups dedicated to Loki worship, possibly a lot more than that. I estimated very much on the conservative side because lots of people are members of multiple groups and I didn't want to miscount. So I just kind of took the population of the largest single group I could find. People of all ages, genders, races, and ethnicities report being called by or having positive experiences with Loki. He is someone who a lot of people seem to feel comes to them, where they will notice a presence in their life or just feel a very strong call rather than someone who I feel like people are looking up and saying, oh, this is a good deity to ask for this thing. He does seem to be open to that. One thing he does not seem to appreciate is every now and then you'll hear a story of a maybe edgy group calling on Loki to kind of treat him as a Satan chaos figure that he tends to address in amusing karmic ways. Oh, I also want to repeat something I said about Loki's pronouns when the mic was off earlier. Loki uses all the pronouns. You will find books out there by Lokians using he, she, they. I personally have used he for a very long time, and he doesn't seem to mind, but there are times when other pronouns are appropriate, and there are other people who use other pronouns all the time. Loki is an anarchist in many senses of the word, and that seems to include pronoun anarchy. Some Lokians begin in heathen traditions and then feel drawn to Loki as a specific patron of theirs, while others don't actually work with heathen traditions or many other Norse deities, but do feel called by Loki or find that he's showing up in their practice. I've met Wiccans, eclectic pagans, all kinds of people who felt that Loki kind of came to them and extended an invitation to work together. Some people who work with Loki report being introduced through mythology books or heathen practices. Some, yes, through the Marvel movies. There seem to be some people who become interested in him that way and then end up seeing, generally when Lokians see Loki, I have found they're not usually picturing Tom Hiddleston. Some do, and he does like to shapeshift. But you'll find more art from devotional pagan Lokians featuring red-haired, very pale, not always red-haired because again shapeshifter, but a more mythological view. You do have to search Loki mythology to get those images on Google, though, because otherwise you'll get all Marvels. And for those who are not familiar, Marvel takes some significant creative liberties with the whole mythological family situation with their Loki and Thor. So Loki, not actually Thor's brother, actually kind of his adoptive uncle, which makes the power dynamics very different, as you might imagine. Any questions, reports, anecdotes? All right, I'm going to check the chat to make sure no more reports of technical difficulties. All right, seems like we're good since fixing the mic issue. The question of how modern people experience Loki is very interesting and very important, I think, because some historians have noted that there isn't a lot of evidence of a cult of Loki worship in Scandinavia, although others disagree with that and point out that some house spirit traditions seem to invoke Loki, and that there are some depictions that appear to invoke him in charms and prayers. But Loki worship today, what does it look like? Don't have a lot of records of it historically. So worshippers do report that Loki can be mischievous and scary, not what we would generally describe as a traditional warm fuzzy deity, although he does do that too. Another thing that just about every Lokian I've spoken to, and that's a lot of people, have reported that he seems very protective after he's gotten to know you. I've actually heard of people having problems with Loki potentially being overprotective toward them in their relationships with other beings. And this is all very interesting because Loki obviously has a reputation as a scary, mischievous spirit, but the folk traditions that seem to be invoking his name actually are about protections of children. There's a tradition of invoking Loki to protect children in some rural parts of Scandinavia, and so there does seem to be reason to believe that the kind of mischievous yet protective vibe goes way back. He often, in the modern world at least, emphasizes boundaries and sovereignty, standing up for oneself. For me personally, he's been very helpful in severing unhealthy ties of shame, guilt, and fear, and embracing one's own inner power. One thing that Loki is very famous for is encouraging people to defend themselves, even potentially against authority figures, which is something we get a lot in imperial societies where people feel that it is wrong or impossible to stand up to authority figures in their lives, and Loki seems to help a lot of people with that. He's also described as enthusiastic and uninhibited. Lots of people say he likes candy, especially cinnamon candy and fireball whiskey. It's sort of definitely a very enthusiastic spirit. And this is all surprisingly consistent, given that it's mostly UPG, with Loki's role in Norse mythology and with some of the folk traditions about him in Scandinavia. So let's move on to those. Any questions, comments, concerns? Alrighty, and there's also in the resources section at the end links to a couple of scholarly articles documenting some of the finds where Loki does appear to be invoked or prayed to as a house spirit or as a protective deity. So here we get into the question of demon or house spirit. It is easy to look at the Eddas, which are the main texts we have for Norse paganism, and see how one could interpret Loki as a Satan-like figure toward the end. He is implied to be well, I suppose the web of responsibility is complicated, but he plays at least a major role in the end of the world, and he does, at one point in the Eddas, murder a god who everyone seems to love for unclear reasons. So that has led to a Christian interpretation of him as Norse Satan. You know, he's the bad guy, he's the enemy of the other gods. A couple interesting things to note about that. One is that the author of those myths was himself a Christian. We unfortunately do not have written records from before the Christianization of the Norse territories, because there may have actually been a specific prohibition on writing certain things down. So the accounts we have are Christian. It is not known, unfortunately, to what extent the author was trying to make Norse mythology match Christian theology, but there's a lot of suspicion that, particularly in the later chapters, the portrayal of Loki might have been influenced by Christian ideas. Meanwhile, in some rural areas of Scandinavia, we have a folk tradition where Loki seems to be invoked as a house spirit or a shamanic spirit, not the kind of guy you build temples to, but the kind who maybe you throw your kid's baby teeth into the hearth fire and ask Loki to watch over the child, look after them, which is a tradition that we know exists. Any questions, comments, concerns? Alright, well, here are our arguments for Loki as Norse Satan. In the Norse myths, he does destroy a lot of things. Destroys a lot of things. He cuts Sif's hair, he steals Idun's apples, does all kinds of things, even prior to the most well-known myth, which is where he does kill Balder, who is alternately interpreted as a sun god or a god of wisdom. Side note, the Norse had a different sun deity, so probably not a sun god. So he does wreck a lot of stuff. He also seems to play a parent of monsters role. Interestingly, he actually slots really well into a cross pantheon slot called Mother of Monsters. The interesting part, obviously, being that he is not usually depicted as a female in Norse mythology, although sometimes he is. But there are at least two major mythic sort of slots or stereotypes. They're typically occupied by women that Loki appears to fill, and Mother of Monsters is one of them. Which again, all the pronouns. And his children are thought to bring about the end of the world, which some people say is a sure sign that he is in a force of evil and an originator of evil. But again, that's a little complicated because those children also fit into the cross-pantheon mythic slot of the self-fulfilling prophecy, where the hero ends up killing the oppressive ruler. So that's all very interesting. And yeah, he murders a couple of servants and the god Balder in his most prominent appearance in the myth, according to Snorri Sturluson. Any questions, comments, concerns? I'm gonna check the text channel once more. No new text. I think we're good. All right. And obviously, Christian authors do not like Loki very much. They tend not to like trickster or rule-breaking figures at all, and they have some material to make an argument that he's not the best guy. But this assessment also leaves out most of the important things he does in the myths, which we're going to talk about now. So a necessary force for good. Every time, and I mean, I checked, and every single time that I could find that Loki screws something up in the myths, they end up with something better than they would have had if Loki had not screwed up the original plan. And this has been very true to my experience of Loki, where, every time something goes wrong in my life in general, if I respond properly, we actually end up with something better than would have happened if things had gone according to plan. We're going to list some of the things that Loki is directly responsible for creating or procuring for the gods that a lot of people don't realize. So he is actually kind of responsible for the gods getting Valhalla without having to pay the construction fee. He is commonly portrayed as screwing up that process because he makes a suggestion that almost messes it up. But then, because he made that suggestion, they also end up with a magical horse that can carry Odin between spiritual realms, which no other speed can do. We end up with that horse because Loki gives birth to it after seducing a giant stallion, which technically means Odin is riding his nephew into battle, but we won't think about that too hard. I'll leave that for the Odin people. When Loki cuts the hair of Sif, Thor's wife, whose hair is generally believed to symbolize the golden flowing waves of grain, he goes to make up for this act, granted under some coercion from Thor. But he ends up bringing back not only better magical hair for Sif, but also all of these other things, including Odin's spear, Thor's hammer, lots of other things that are very famous and important in Norse mythology. Directly Loki's fault and Loki's doing, which shows us again that when he messes something up, it tends to end up better. So it's difficult at this point to make any sort of argument for him being a bad guy. Because at this point, the gods owe Loki, like, most of their stuff, almost all of their important artifacts. Any questions, comments, expansions? Alrighty. And the most vicious we see Loki is in the myth around the death of Balder. And what's interesting about that is that, to me, and I'm not the only analyst that thinks this myth almost represents a weird character break for Loki. We've seen him play pranks. We've seen him give questionable advice. We haven't seen him murder anyone who wasn't the kind of giant that Thor also murders up to this point. But all of a sudden things take a very dark turn. The whole Balder situation is also weird because Balder is rarely, if ever, mentioned in the Norse myths before this myth, which is particularly strange because there are previous myths that mention deities we don't know anything about. There's just a mention of a name. The name is literally all we know. So the myths were clearly part of a corpus of larger work, much of which is lost to us, but Balder is not mentioned in any of those myths, to my knowledge. He just kind of seems to show up, suddenly be terribly important, and like the best person ever, and possibly the sun god, even though the Norse had a sun goddess, and kind of seems like a Christianization thing, honestly. A lot of scholars think that this kind of smacks of Snorri maybe trying to work the death and resurrection of Christ into Norse mythology. All of a sudden there's this one true God who ends up ruling over the new world, as we'll see, and who gets murdered and rises from the dead. So make of that what you will. We've also got the matter of Loki's children, because Loki's children include several monsters who kill the gods in various ways. We've got Hela, who rules over the underworld, where people who, depending on who you ask, there are varying numbers of Norse afterlives, but Hela is generally considered to rule over one of the less glorious ones. So she's got kind of a little bit of a demon vibe going on. There's Fenrir, who eats some deities. There's Jormungandr, who kind of destroys the world a little bit because he's just that big and powerful that when he gets upset, the whole ocean gets upset. So these are traditionally thought of, at least by post-Christian myth writers, as demons, bad things. Some people have asserted that Fenrir, for example, actually represents dishonor, because wolf was sometimes a term used for a person who had committed murder outside the law. But, again, I mentioned earlier, we have an interesting thing going on where these children of Loki also kind of fit into the self-fulfilling prophecy trope. This is a trope we find with Krishna, with Oedipus, with a lot of heroes in other sort of Proto-Indo-European root mythologies, where there is a hero born, and the ruler decides to preemptively punish or attempt to kill the hero because it has been prophesied that the hero will overthrow him. In the case of Loki's children, Odin and the other residents of Valhalla, it is prophesied that Loki's children will kill them. So they attempt to preemptively imprison and banish Loki's children. And some modern interpreters have asked, well, if the gods hadn't imprisoned and banished the kids, would the kids have murdered them? We don't really have any way of knowing, but that puts another very interesting spin on this whole situation. Are we looking at, Christian style inherently malevolent demons here, or are we looking at a self-fulfilling prophecy where there is maybe an overly enthusiastic order trying to keep order? Any questions, comments, concerns so far? Alright, gonna check the text chat. Looks like we're good. And we've mentioned earlier that Loki does seem to have a role both in Scandinavian tradition and in the myths and in modern practice as a protector of children. In addition to the Scandinavian folk practice of asking Loki to protect children while throwing baby teeth into a fire, which suggests a hearth connection, very common thing for a household god. We also have a myth in which Loki murders a giant that was trying to attack a parent and child. This kind of happens in isolation, separate from the rest of the myth cycle, but there seems to be a very strong, don't mess with children or Loki will murder you vibe going on there. And yeah, so that's a interesting hypothesis that also ties into Loki having these children who are imprisoned and banished, but who ultimately end up overthrowing the deities who did that to them with Loki's help. We've also talked about the possibility of Loki as an LGBTQ plus patron. Sorry, I'm bi and I still have trouble saying that. Where, in addition to his own obvious gender bending and doing whatever he wants with sex and gender and social roles in general, it is also actually very common for cultures that have shamanic or psychopomp practices to view gender bending or multi-gendered people as having special spiritual power. The idea appears to be that either I've seen one of two interpretations. Either the divine encompasses more than one gender, therefore someone who encompasses more than one gender is closer to the divine than those who don't. Or the idea that someone who encompasses more than one gender or has a different gender from the sex they were assigned at birth has performed a sort of crossing over that is similar to the crossing over that is necessary to enter the spirit world. So in American Indian cultures, for example, you actually see a lot of two-spirit is the word that some tribes used for people who had non-traditional gender roles, and you actually saw a lot of them in spiritual healing capacities, spiritual practitioners, and also diplomats. There's a surprising number of Native American diplomats that if you look into in the history books were actually two-spirit, and the history books don't mention that, so you kind of got it. But so there's a very interesting argument to be made for Loki as both a shamanic spirit and a potential, origin in something that looks more like an indigenous culture with a trickster figure who helps to create new things than an imperial culture where you've got good guys and then bad guys who try to disrupt the established order. Any questions about that for anyone? All right, I know I'm throwing some text walls at you here. I'm a writer by my primary trade, so hopefully these slides will be useful to someone if anyone wants to download them. Now we've got the whole Baldur situation, which is the thing that Loki is best known for and regarded by some people as the defining event of Norse mythology. It's the, if Snorri Sturluson's interpretations are to be trusted, it's the end of one world and the beginning of a new, which plays a key role in mythologies around the world. And this end of the world and beginning of new is always an interesting topic in all the mythologies, because on one hand, it is often viewed as something of a bad thing. People generally don't want to all get murdered by armies of the undead. But it is also often looked forward to as a good thing. I was just watching a very interesting discussion between some Christians, actually, over the weekend about why Christians have very different attitudes toward the end of the world in Christianity, because some of them are like, oh no, we have to stop this from happening, but others are like, wait, according to the prophecy, things actually get better after the world. So which one was it for the Norse? Did they view Ragnarok as a bad thing? Did they view it as a good thing? This is especially complicated by the fact that the Vikings really glorified fighting and dying in battle, so was the biggest battle ever necessarily a bad thing for them? Well, let's look at some arguments for and against. The question of why Loki killed Balder is very open for debate. No clear motive is given. It's just kind of shown that he decides to do it. A lot of people think that it's heavily implied that there was a jealousy element. Balder was, in this myth, considered the best person ever. He was getting a lot of attention. The whole way Loki kind of tricked someone into killing Balder was that Balder had actually become immortal. So following the prophecy that Balder would be killed, his parents freaked out and his mother ran around and got vows from everything in the world not to harm Balder. So Balder's essentially invulnerable, except for this little mistletoe plant, which Frigg thought, oh, it's a young plant, it's not, at the age of consent yet, so I'm not going to get an oath from this plant. So Loki, of course, takes the plant, makes an arrow, and tricks someone into shooting Balder with it. Why did he do this? Jealousy that Balder was getting a lot of attention doesn't really actually make sense in my opinion. A lot of people have pointed out that Balder's death actually resembles a sacrifice that Odin demanded in a previous myth, where Odin required that a king be killed in order to guarantee the prosperity of his people. This may also be related to the fact that Odin obtained a lot of his wisdom and power by sacrificing himself in a previous myth in order to come back better and wiser. So there is an ongoing theme of sacrifice producing good things, and Balder was also prophesied to return from the dead in his myth. So if they knew he was going to be resurrected, that almost puts it into Jesus territory. Can we view a murder the same way if you know that the person is going to come back better? And what's weird is that a big deal is made in the myth where Balder's body is buried of the fact that Odin whispers something in Balder's ear, and no one knows what it is, and this is never revealed. So it's a big deal that Odin knows something about Balder that no one else knows, that becomes relevant at the time of his death. Why is that a big deal? Why is that emphasized in more than one myth? Because there's also a later myth where someone references the fact that no one knows what Odin said. Is it because Odin is potentially in on something with Loki and or Balder? So here's a list of some of the commonly suggested motives. There's jealousy, anger over Loki's own children being exiled and imprisoned in various things while Balder was made immortal. Balder was technically the cousin of Loki's children, so definitely a little unequal treatment happening there. Was there a desire to overturn the old divine order and create a new, better order, which is, we are told, actually what happens during Ragnarok. A new world is created, new humans are created, Balder comes back, and it is implied that he is a better ruler than Odin. And if it was the desire to overturn the old order to create a new, better one, were Odin and Balder in on this? One, both of them? We don't know. And before I continue with this next interesting point, any questions, comments, concerns? Let me check our time. All right, so we are getting toward the end of the 60-minute mark. We're also getting toward the end of the presentation, I promise. But if anyone needs to go, by all means, head off. We've only got a few slides left before we get to the resource. And I'm going to check the text chats. Nope, no new urgent messages. So there's been a theory raised recently that Loki himself might be a little bit of a Jesus analog, which is weird, right? Definitely not what we would think of, not what we would expect Thorolson to intend, but he does get punished with potentially eons of torture for Baldur's death and some other shenanigans he pulls, where he roasts all the gods in a feasting hall. It's pretty great, actually. And some scholars have interpreted this as Loki again being a devil analog, condemned to hell, general source of malfeasance, etc. But other people have pointed out that there is a sort of sacrifice to make things better component going on, and that it's possible that Balder is the Jesus analog in this situation. It's also possible that Loki is, because Loki bears a distinct resemblance to some Christian traditions in this role. For example, we've got the idea of a scapegoat, which is where the sins of a village would be literally or metaphorically placed onto a goat, which was then sacrificed. So is Loki doing a sort of sacrifice to cleanse the sins of the god and make this new world possible? We don't know. But that's another interesting perspective that some historians have thrown out there. And we also come to the question of whether Ragnarok is viewed as a good or a bad thing. And this again is actually, there's a lot of specific things in Viking culture about how much the Vikings love battle. But again, this is actually something we see in modern Christianity and even a little bit in Islam, where the things that go with the end of the world are not supposed to be fun, they're rather violent, but things are supposed to get better after the end of the world. So we get some Christians and Muslims who believe that we need to prevent things that might herald or cause the end of the world, and others who actually want to hasten it. Was Ragnarok a similar situation for the Vikings? This again is something that unfortunately we don't have a clear idea of, because Ragnarok is clearly described as not being fun, but it's also clearly described as things getting better afterwards, and a new world with a new god and humans. Another question is whether pre-Christian peoples even did good and evil in the same way that imperial religions of today do. Generally, when you have an imperial religion, that's one where there's one right way to do things, there are other things that are never supposed to happen. When you have indigenous religions, you get more of a sense of balance. If you're living in communion with the land rather than in a primarily martial lifestyle, you know that new things don't get made without old things being destroyed. You know that sometimes growth and strength are incurred by challenging things in the natural world. And you know that there are different times when different approaches are good ideas. Whereas in imperial religions, you get more of there's an end goal that we're driving toward. We're not so much working in cycles. And there's a certain set of virtues that is always correct, and a certain set of vices, generally including questioning authority and that kind of thing, that are always bad. And we've got some interesting polytheism theology here, arguing that in polytheistic religions, many gods are necessary because the infinity that is represented by the divine can't all be encapsulated in a single personality that is even remotely comprehensible to humans. So you have many different deities embodying different virtues that are all good but different, including the trickster virtue, which is treated with at least some admiration in most polytheistic cultures. And definitely so in the Viking cultures. Even Odin and Thor get some props for being tricky at times, but mostly Odin, if we're being honest. And this again goes back to how things work in the natural world, because in nature you can't have creation without destruction. In the man-made world, people will try to argue, oh no, we can just create things forever with no consequences. And that can stem from a little bit of the, creation is always good, destruction is always bad, and that's just working out great for capitalism and climate change right now. Any questions, comments, concerns before I move on and get toward wrapping up? All right. And so we come back to the question of indigenous versus imperial religions. Where in indigenous religions, the trickster is actually really great. They invent a lot of new things. They also cause trouble, but they invent things, they help people out, they help deities out, and when they cause problems, someone generally learns from it. Also a big thing in the natural world, learning from problems so you can be more prepared in the future, as opposed to the imperial approach of just eliminating problems, which rarely succeeds in my experience. So does this put Loki in more of an indigenous trickster role? In my opinion, yes. In my opinion, he behaves very much like that, and the Norse Satan characterization is not very accurate at all. The major difference between these two models is, of course, authority and change. Imperial religions really like authority, really dislike change. Indigenous religions tend to be leery of any one individual, including mythical figures, getting too much authority over others, and tend to embrace change, because change can be bad, but it can also be very good. Tricksters are obviously not well loved by authority figures, very much including Abrahamic religious teachers, imperial government figures. They don't want people running around thinking that challenging them or outsmarting them is ever a good idea. Tricksters also tend to be more sensitive to change and to cause change, which again, indigenous people tend to recognize can be good or bad. Imperial religions tend not to like change, because any change threatens the imperial order. And a culture's ability to notice change is actually really interesting. There have been studies done that show that people with more conservative leanings are actually slower to recognize when their physical surroundings are changing. If you show them a picture or a shape or a color and then begin to slowly change it, like on a computer screen, they will refuse to acknowledge that even these innocuous sensory things are changing, whereas people with more progressive leanings in politics, according to these self-identified surveys, are actually faster to notice when change is occurring and respond to it, which I just thought was very interesting, because there is a question here of embracing change versus denying that it's good. And in order to deny that it can be good, you kind of have to deny that it's inevitable, right? You've got to kind of think that if nobody messes things up, things are going to stay the same forever. So what does our view on Loki say about us? My opinion is that what I've seen in Lokian circles and in pagan circles that are beginning to change their view of Loki for the better, there's a growing recognition that change is necessary to create new things, and a openness and receptiveness to change is necessary for survival. There is possibly a return to some of, at least those of us with Scandinavian ancestry, our ancestral views that we have this protective spirit that is not necessarily a warm, fuzzy, rule follower type of spirit, but is fiercely protective, and that their mischievousness might actually facilitate that. And there's also a strong undercurrent of social justice sentiment I noticed with Lokians. Lokians tend to identify with people who some would say, like Loki's children, tend to be outcast, preemptively punished for being born different or not conforming. Lots of LGBTQ plus people, also lots of general anti-imperial, you can't trust authority type of sentiment is welcome in Lokian circles. Because Loki is definitely someone who is gonna call authority out and possibly smash stuff up if need be, if the authority is not necessarily all that they claim to be. So what can we expect from the future? Well, in my opinion, we can expect Loki worship and Lokian circles to keep growing. this is definitely a time when a lot of people are recognizing that change is inevitable and potentially helpful. When there's an increasing amount of social justice and anti-authoritarian, at the very least, suspicion. And definitely among new generations, I feel like we're seeing people who are more comfortable having intimate relationships with gods, which is something that Loki definitely seems to do a lot of, and who are mutually supportive in bucking mainstream assumptions, because we've still got, in my opinion, some vestiges of imperial thought about distance and formality in our relationships with our deities, and that is continuing to be increasingly disregarded by younger generations, in my observation. I think that's just about all I've got until we get to the resources. Just a last slide about Loki is kind of a theological Rorschach test. Like, what you see in Loki might say some things about you because he does so many different kinds of things, and there's so many different theories about him that there's a lot there to choose from and a lot to kind of project onto. And now we've got our resources. So I'm going to move back to the group chat to make sure I can see anything that anyone's trying to say. And that's our talk for today. I'm happy to answer questions or host discussions. I find that Lokians often have very interesting discussions. Any questions? Funny stories? Times you set something on fire? Okay. In the resources here, we've got links to several books that have been put out by different organizations of devotionals to Loki. We've got the largest, and in my experience, most well-moderated Facebook group, Loki's Weirdlings here. Loki University, the moderator of Loki's Weirdlings, has actually put together a nice body of both practical experience and scholarly research about Loki and history that anybody, it's free to get in. Anybody can take the Loki University courses. And here are some of the scholarly sources that either are direct records we have of Norse myths or are kind of reviews of some of the archaeological evidence we have in which Loki's name or face comes. Any other questions? If not, I think we are getting toward being wrapped up. All right, well, thank you all for coming, and thank you for your patience with my audio difficulty at the beginning. I hope everyone is having a wonderful Pagan Pride. I know I've really been enjoying seeing the lineup here. I think I was at another class attending with a couple of you earlier. So it's been great to see everyone. And again, this talk will be available on the Pagan Pride YouTube channel for anyone who might be interested but couldn't be here. And I do encourage you to donate to Pagan Pride if you're able, because the folks do a lot of work behind the scenes. I've seen it, and if we want to have community events, someone needs to be contributing. I've had some interesting back-to-back discussions about that recently. But I hope you're all having a wonderful day, and I am not on for my Christians and Pagans talk for another hour, so I'm going to hang out here if anyone has any questions or wants to discuss.